Djibouti as disaster displacement advisor. And I want to welcome you from all the organizer side, like from IGAD, Undp, and the PDD, to this webinar today. And our topic, as you have seen, hopefully on the flyer and everywhere, is on human mobility and climate change, and of course linked then to the African GCM review. I think first I want to start with just some generic comments on the side event as such. So we will have 6 speakers today, and the event will be recorded. I think you probably already have seen it plopping up on your screen. There is also interpretation from French into English available. Et pour les personnes qui parlent français, il y a aussi l'interprétation. And please also, I think you're all used to that. So please, if you're not speaking, mute yourself. And then of course, if you're speaking, unmute, and maybe also put the camera on, because I think it is also useful these days to see sometimes some faces and not only the names on it. And yes, so with these few remarks, I would like to pass on to Madame Fatia Alwan, who is the Director from Health and Social Development at IGAD, to come with, to present some opening remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, bon après-midi, and salam to everyone from IGAD Secretariat Djibouti. Thank you, Lina, for moderating actually this meeting. My name is Fatia Alwan. I'm the Director of Health and Social Development, and my greetings to all of you. Distinguished partners, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and privilege to welcome you to the side event of human mobility in the context of disaster and climate change in Africa. The African Regional Review Conference of the Global Compact on Migration is a very important platform to take stock of what we have achieved since the adoption in 2018, and also to discuss our priorities, challenge, and opportunities. In the IGAD region, one of the main challenges that we are facing is the high number of disasters and the negative impacts of climate change in the region. With 2/3 of the IGAD region being arid and semi-arid, we are also regularly faced with drought, floods, landslide, and other natural hazards. The figures by the International Displacement Monitoring Center show that 2020 alone, almost 3 million of people were newly displaced by disaster, and also the adverse effects of climate change in the IGAD region. And often, disaster displacement occurs in places already affected by conflict and violence. People are also migrating to cope with the negative impacts of climate change. Pastoralists, for example, use migration as a traditional method to access water and grazing land in times of environmental stress. Managed properly, migration has the potential to support affected community to better cope with a slow onset event. To address this challenge and opportunities, IGAD is working, number one, first, with member states to raise awareness about the link between climate change and human mobility, and also to identify the challenge and solutions. In the past years, we have organized several regional consultations on the topic. Second, we are also supporting the development and implementation of policies related to the migration and displacement in the context of disasters and climate change. This includes the translation of global policies into the regional and national policies and action. For example, also we have supported our member states to advocate the inclusion of climate change into the Global Compact for Migration. At the regional level, the new IGAD Free Movement of Persons Protocol, which has been adopted in June 2021 in Khartoum by the IGAD Council of Ministers, is a unique opportunity. We successfully encourage member states to include of a specific provision for people affected by disaster. This is actually the first time that the Free Movement of Persons Protocol specifically address the need of disaster displaced people. The next step is also to support the member state in the implementation of the protocol. The third area of action is on IGAD, the improvement of knowledge and data on human mobility, disaster, and climate change. Here, we are working closely with IGAD Climate Prediction and which a center based in Nairobi, ICPAC, to better link the climate data and the seasonal forecast with displacement and migration data, and also to develop the disaster displacement risk model together with several partners. And last but not least, we have just launched a new joint program on human mobility and climate change in the IGAD region, together with our partners IOM, ILO, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and also UNHCR. This is the program funded by the Migration Multi-Trust Fund to implement the GCM. Collectively, the following priorities were identified in the joint program. First, the need to generate data to better map, understand, and predict and address also migration movement and the risk of displacement. Second, the inclusion of disaster, climate change, and environmental degradation of national and regional human mobility policies, and also vice versa, the inclusion of human mobility in climate change and disaster preparedness strategy. Third, to strengthen the preparedness and response capacity through the development of standard operational procedure on admission and stay in disaster solutions, and through cross-border simulation exercise. And fourth, to support the implementation of regional and national human mobility framework to enhance the availability and flexibility of pathway for regular migration. With these various interventions, we aim also to support our IGAD member state to better prepare for prevent and respond to disaster displacement, and also to contribute to facilitating regular migration in the region. As I'm concluding, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from other speakers today about their experience and also the effective practice on human mobility in the context of disaster and climate change. Thank you and merci to you. Over to you, Lina. Merci. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Madame Fatia, for these opening remarks on behalf of IGAD. And I think it is very nice to see and to start with what is already being done in the region and what is also what are the plans for the next few years. And I know that you have to leave for another meeting right now. So we are very grateful that you took the time to be here for the opening remarks. And for the questions afterwards, I mean, I'm from IGAD side, will still be here when there are some comments or questions that are directed to IGAD. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you to all of you. Merci.
Thank you. And this is also something that I haven't mentioned before, but of course we are grateful for all the comments and questions you are having to all the panelists. So there is the chat function. So please just put your comments and questions into the chat function, because we will still have enough time in the end of this event where we can address these questions. Thank you. And with this one, I would like to pass the floor to Professor Walter Kellin, who is the envoy of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And thanks a lot for taking the time to be here with us today, because we're looking forward to your insights on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honored, and it's a great pleasure for me to join this panel today in my capacity as envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. I'm particularly pleased to be invited to set the scene for such a great group of panelists. The Platform on Disaster Displacement, PDD, is a state-led initiative following up on the Nansen Initiative, working towards better protection of persons displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. And the relevance of our Nansen Initiative protection agenda and of our work as PDD for developing and implementing coherent approaches to the challenges of human mobility in the context of disasters, environmental change, and the adverse effects of climate change is explicitly recognized in Objective 2 of the GCM. And with Kenya, Madagascar, Morocco, and Senegal, several members of our steering group are African states. We work closely with several sub-regional organizations, including in particular with IGAD. The topic of today's event brings back many memories of people I have met in the course of my work in the region. They range from former pastoralists displaced by drought, lingering in neglected IDP camps and settlements in the Horn of Africa with no hope for a better future, to communities relocated from floodplains to new villages on higher grounds in Mozambique, where they are now protected, better protected against the hazards, or individuals able to cope with the impacts of disasters in Western Africa because the ECOWAS agreement on free movement allowed them to find work in neighboring countries during times of drought or flooding and support their families with remittances. It is for people like these that we are here today to contribute to reviewing the implementation of the GCM in Africa. According to what we call at PDD, the toolbox approach. In fact, much can be done to help people like these, people who are affected by disasters, the adverse impacts of climate change. We can reduce hazards associated with global warming if emitters fully implement the Paris Agreement on climate change, and if they substantially reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. We can help people to stay if we invest systematically in disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation measures, and resilience building activities. We can help people at risk of displacement moving out of harm's way by opening pathways for safe, orderly, and regular migration, including across borders. And finally, we can protect those displaced by ensuring that they are not forcibly sent back to where their life is at risk, as one aspect of protection. What is important for us is to realize that the Global Compact on Migration and its 23 objectives address all these aspects, at least in one way or another. The objectives, the actions proposed include instruments and tools to address the factors that compel people to move across borders, including disasters and the adverse effects of climate change. They include tools and instruments that address the need for better data and knowledge to support evidence-based policies. And they also address the issue of enhancing legal pathways, legal pathways for people compelled to move in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change. While most of the GCM objectives are relevant in situations of human mobility linked to disasters and climate change scenarios, 4 objectives are particularly and directly relevant. These are: first, Objective 2, on minimizing the adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their country of origin. Then, second, Objective 5, on enhancing the availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration. Furthermore, Objective 21, on facilitating safe and dignified return and readmission, as well as sustainable reintegration where return is possible. And finally, Objective 23, on strengthening international cooperation and global partnership for safe, orderly and regular migration, including in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change. PDD is proud to be actively contributing to the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration in Africa through several of our activities. For instance, we have a project together with IOM, UNHCR and others, financed by France in the ECOWAS region. Or recently, we conducted together with the Caldor Center a workshop series to bring together academics across the continent to develop a research agenda focusing among others on migration and the free movement of persons in disaster and climate change contexts. Following up on the presentation by Her Excellency Madame Fatih Alwan, I would like to say a few additional words on the joint regional migration multi-partner trust fund program in the IGAD region, because it's an excellent example of how partnerships can contribute towards developing and implementing coherent approaches to the challenges we face. The joint efforts of IOM, ILO, UNHCR, PDD, and IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center, ICPAC, include the development of displacement risk models to build forecasts and to explore future displacement scenarios based on climatic and other factors. The models will estimate the likelihood of climate-related displacement in the IGAD region. They will be at the disposal of each national government to enhance access to quality data and evidence on disaster displacement risk in order to prevent displacement in such contexts. Such knowledge is indispensable for planning activities to implement GCM Objective 2. Moreover, through the development of standard operating procedures on admission and stay, which will be put to test through simulation exercises involving 2 neighboring countries. The joint efforts will also help to address the challenges linked to cross-border displacement and strengthen solutions as well as enhance pathways for people compelled to move. All of that in line with Objective 5 of the GCM. In the IGAD region, such standard operational procedures are an essential element to put into practice Article 16 of IGAD's new protocol on the free movement of persons, because this protocol provides for the admission by other countries of persons affected by disasters. But to make that operational requires guidance, it requires investments, it requires capacity. Let me conclude. As we review the GCM implementation in Africa, the development and implementation of such policy frameworks is key. At the same time, tracking progress in their implementation remains a challenge, particularly in the absence of specific indicators aimed at measuring GCM implementation. It is therefore important that all stakeholders work together to support ongoing efforts and address the remaining gaps in implementing the GCM objectives in Africa. PDD remains committed to supporting these efforts, both in the IGAD region, but also in other regions in Africa, as well as through sharing experiences and effective practices from other regions of the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Walter Kellin, for this overview. I think it was extremely useful also for the ones who are not so familiar with the topic to really have the overview on how actually human mobility and climate change is anchored into the GCM. And also that there are many tools that exist. Of course, it is now only about implementation. And thanks a lot for this overview. And with this one, I would like to give the floor to UNDP. So from UNDP side, it is Ms. Cecilia Ipira, who is the UNDP team leader for disaster risk reduction in Africa. And I'm sure you can complement also on kind of the activities that are implemented by UNDP in the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena, and thank you, colleagues that have spoken before me. Ladies, partners, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you to this side event on human mobility in the context of disasters and climate change in Africa. Today, I'm actually speaking on behalf of the director for the UNDP Regional Service Center, who was unable to join us today. However, the topic of displacement and climate change and disasters is something that is actually very personal to me. I come from Malawi, for those who don't know. It's a very small village on the shores of Lake Malawi. And I have very, very vivid memories of me and my grandmother making bricks, mud bricks, new mud bricks to build our new house because the old one had been swept away by floods. We were known as fisher folk, but now we live in the mountains. We ran away from the floods on the shoreline of Lake Malawi, and we also ran away from malaria. It's a muddy lake with lots of weeds and therefore lots of mosquitoes and therefore lots of malaria. But also there were push factors. In the 80s, they were building new schools. In the 70s, in the 80s, there was a new school that obviously was built up in the mountains. There was a new road coming, opening up the whole area. And so the whole village moved. Actually, in the last 40 years, the village has moved 3 times because of changes in the climate, but also because of other economic factors. So it's something that's very personal to me, and it's something that I've actually experienced. But today, with climate change, I think many will not be as lucky as I have, that I was only able to move a distance of about 30, 40 kilometers from where the original village was. Many will have to dig in, suffering through the heat, hunger, and political chaos. But I think many others will be forced, like I was, forced to move across villages, towns, but even take risky journeys across borders into other countries. I think existing studies do not necessarily provide us a strong link or the evidence of human mobility being attributed to climate change alone. And I think, as you've just seen from my example, climate change is rarely the main cause of migration and displacement, but it's definitely one of the main exacerbating factors. Reasons people move, there are many due to multitude of factors. It can be declining natural resources such as depleting groundwater, intercommunal or internal or cross-border conflict, better economic opportunities elsewhere, especially with what we are seeing with rural-urban migration among the youth. So I think when we are talking about disaster-induced migration, we would also have to be taking into account of all these factors. And we also need to understand, and I think in a more in-depth manner, how climate change will push people across borders and how do we prepare for that. While we are still building our understanding on these issues, I think the links between climate change and human mobility have been recognized and are starting to be addressed to varying degrees across many global regimes. That includes the UN United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. But we also seeing the agenda, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Africa We Want, All of these are starting to look at, how do we address both climate change and migration. They're not explicitly there, but there is a recognition that we need to start addressing these issues. And I think the platform on disaster displacement, which one of the co-organizers of today's discussion together with IGAD, has an important role to play in supporting national governments in mainstreaming or integrating approaches that support human mobility into broader policies. Climate-induced migration is now addressed from an adaptive perspective. There's an urgent need for a comprehensive report, I think, on the scope, nature, the implications of climate-induced displacement across all relevant areas on the African context, including modeling, forecasting in order to accurately mitigate climate change-induced migration. And some of these factors have already been mentioned by my previous, the previous speakers. I think there's a need for a greater collaboration on research on climate-induced migration and mobility in Africa, I think, which would be an important initiative to support adaptation, resilience building, disaster preparedness, protection, relocation, humanitarian coordination, and rights-based response. The work of the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, represented today in the panel, would also contribute very much to these efforts together with other partners. The Global Compact on Migration and Refugees offer the scope for climate risk-informed action, for example. The former is likely to include a recognition of migration as an adaptation strategy. There is need to invest in reducing climate and disaster risks, invest in preparedness, taking into account, of course, the global, regional, and national early warning systems and early action mechanisms. But also there's need to invest in enhanced evidence-based forecasting. How do we predict, how do we forecast future movements and emergencies, including in situations of forced internal migration? To achieve the Africa we want by 2063, tackling the factors driving forced migration and displacement is critical for Africa. These factors come as a combination of many factors: weakened governance, violent conflict, extreme poverty, inequality, climate change, obviously, and environmental degradation. Many of these are very much intertwined and interlinked. And so the role of and the leadership of national governments also in this regard, I think, would be extremely, extremely critical. As I head towards concluding my remarks, allow me to share briefly some of the work that UNDP is doing on disaster risk reduction, climate change, and migration across the continent. In UNDP, we are currently working in over 20 countries across Africa, and that is together with our partners, supporting national governments on finding development solutions on disaster and climate-induced migration and displacement. As UNDP, our approach and messages are that we should use the SDG framework, and for Africa specifically, also use the Africa we want by 2063 as a framework to address climate change and forced migration and displacement. UNDP is investing over 900 million, so just below $1 billion in supporting African government on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and disaster risk reduction, but also on energy, biodiversity conservation, sustainable land management, all of which we believe contribute to support the erosion of our livelihoods and overall resilience building. In recognizing the linkages between climate security also and migration, UNDP is also supporting Africa at the continental and regional level, but also at the national level in strengthening climate security as a means to climate change and adaptation, and also as a contribution to stemming climate-induced migration. In the Horn, UNDP is also active on these thematic areas in the Great Lakes region, the Lake Chad Basin, Lake Chad Basin as well. You know, we are supporting governments and the regional commissions in understanding, you know, bringing the awareness, raising the awareness and then that understanding, but also generating evidence on climate change and conflict dynamics, risks, so that we can you know, support them in developing appropriate risk-informed responses to a very complex emergency. This includes measures on how climate change impacts seed additional pressure, while conflict undermines displaced communities' ability to cope, to respond, and to adapt to climate change. Partners, ladies and gentlemen, I very much look forward to hearing from your experiences on human mobility in the context of disasters and climate change. But also suggestions and ideas on how we can move forward this agenda in the African continent. I thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia, for these remarks and also for sharing your personal story, because I think sometimes we are hearing the numbers. I mean, Madame Fatia at the beginning has also said that like in 2020, there were around 3 million people only in the IGAD region that were displaced by disasters and climate change. But sometimes we forget that actually behind these numbers, there are like for each and every one a personal story. So thanks a lot for sharing that one with all of us. And also for highlighting again that actually the link between human mobility and climate change is already addressed in many of these global regional frameworks. But now, of course, still there are some kind of big gaps that need to be addressed. And also for again showing that there are some tools, like for example on the modeling and the forecasting work that we will also hear later in where we have a specific presentation about that one. So thanks again for sharing your knowledge and time with all of us. Thank you. And with this one, I would like to go to the next speaker, who is Ms. Florence Poppe from BMZ, from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Florence, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, member states, representatives, colleagues from IGAD, UNDP, PDD, and GIZ. Let me start by expressing gratitude for organizing this side event. It comes very timely ahead of the International Migration Review Forum and represents an important occasion to exchange views, identify common challenges, and share good practices. As German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, we closely listen to the demands of our partner countries and support them in addressing their socio-economic challenges. Concerning the realization of the GCM in the region, we also closely work with IGAD, the EU, the UN system, and PDD, and provide evidence-driven and tailor-made solutions. As its largest contributor, Germany considers the Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund an important cornerstone for GCM implementation. We also believe that it still needs to grow more in order to deliver and live up to its expectations. We actually welcome that 9 projects are being funded by the Migration MPTF, or are about to being implemented. And this includes also the already mentioned project in the IGAD region on migration in the context of disasters and climate change. So let me share with you the perspective of German development cooperation on GCM implementation, with a special view on climate-induced migration and including some concrete examples of activities we are funding. Germany submitted last year a report to the Regional Migration Review Forum for Europe and North America. This voluntary report outlined Germany's policy priorities, developments, and challenges in the context of implementing the GCM. It was prepared in a concerted effort between government and non-government stakeholders, following a whole of society and a whole of government approach. As German Development Cooperation, we promote a comprehensive, or as we say, a 360-degree approach to migration and forced displacement. This ranges from mitigating the root causes or structural factors of involuntary migration, supporting refugees and host communities, fostering regular migration, to facilitating voluntary return and sustainable reintegration. When it comes to climate-induced migration, we support people who are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. Both those who had to leave their homes due to climate change and those who do not wish or do not have the possibility to migrate, the so-called trapped populations. We provide advisory services, but also infrastructure measures for partner countries to adapt to climate change and to become more resilient. For example, through coastal protection or alternative farming methods. We also support voluntary and planned relocation, which German Development Cooperation actually considers a last resort. In case that planned relocation is necessary, we advocate for voluntary, participatory, and human rights-based approaches. Indeed, safe, orderly, and regular migration can serve as coping strategy for climate change. And this is actually a policy field that deserves much more international attention. In this context, regional bilateral free movement agreements can help protect those who are forced to leave their homes. Implemented in a proper way, they allow legal entry and residence in the country of destination and provide opportunities for income generation. As Madame Fatih Alban already highlighted, last year's adoption of the Protocol on Free Movements of Persons in the IGAD region and its specific dispositions was certainly an important milestone. And Professor Kalin highlighted also that what is now necessary is to make it operational on the ground so that the people can really benefit from it. So let me now turn to our engagement on climate-induced migration. To address this issue, German Development Cooperation funds the so-called global program Human Mobility in the Context of Climate Change. The program also operates in other regions such as the Caribbean, the Pacific, or in West Africa. In the IGAD region, it focuses on improving the understanding of migration and displacement in the context of slow onset events. As was already mentioned, there's still little data and no standardized methodology for modeling the impacts of droughts and gradual climatic changes on human mobility in the region. Thus, the global program seeks to address this challenge by working together with a group of renowned experts in the field of modeling to support IGAD and its Climate Prediction and Application Center, ICPAC. The modeling will help IGAD and its member states to better prepare for populations movements in the context of slow onset events. Coming back now to the new Migration MPTF project, it will complement ongoing activities under the German-funded global program, and it will be very important now to create synergies and especially closely coordinate the data-related activities of both projects in order to avoid duplication. In addition to our activities focused on climate-induced migration, German Development Cooperation also supports IGAD in advancing its regional migration policies. A special focus lies on the collection of regional migration data, as well as on social inclusion and basic service delivery for vulnerable mobile population in cross-border areas in the IGAD region. As international cooperation both on climate change and on migration have gained much relevance in the past decade, Germany stands ready to continue and step up its cooperation with strategic partners on the African continent. I look forward to fruitful discussions today and wish us all a successful event. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Florence, for these remarks from your side. I think it is, as you have also said, very, again, good to hear also the engagement from Germany including also in the area of modeling and forecasting. I think this is an area and a topic that has come through all these different presentations. And this is also an area where actually each and every organization that is here on the call is working very closely together, and where we also all see, I think, a big potential. And then I think the second point that you also have mentioned that came through like the red lines through all the different presentations is also the role of the free movement of persons arrangements. And here, of course, there are different kind of layers and speeds in the African continent. And I think in the IGAD region that there is actually really a specific notion of disaster displacement. I think this is very unique. And of course, again, it is on implementation, like with all the other topics as well. And with this one, I would like to give the floor to our next speaker. And maybe you have already noticed, if you looked into the flyer, that we were supposed to have also a speaker from the government of Kenya. But unfortunately, he had a last-minute appointment and is not able to join us today. So this is why the number of speakers is reduced to 6, but this also gives us more time for discussion. So with this, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Ikal Angelei, who is the Executive Director of the Friends of Lake Turkana region. Thank you.
Lena. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, friends, comrades. This is a very important conversation. In case my internet goes flaky, I am in Turkana and the internet's not been really good of late. So bear with me, I will go off video. So this is a very important conversation, and picking up from what Madam from IGAD spoke earlier, you know, the aspect, I come from a region that we are predominantly pastoralists. And so migration for pasture and water is really a part of who we are. I think for a long time, we've sort of had this discussion around migration, but then you can see the impact it's intensified now. People are going longer periods in search of water and pasture. People are, as it's straining, and the conflict that comes along with it. So for us, most of the conversations have been, when we're talking about migration, it was really related to, you know, refugees. Again, we are hosts of a refugee community in Kakuma and now the new Kalobe camp. So we've seen this migration by refugees brought around by conflict. But then when we were moving, and ours was really as a part of our life, moving for water and pasture, we never saw it as you know, like forced migration. It was really a rational decision by pastoralists deciding to move to one place or the other. But now we are seeing it's now more intensified, it's deeper, and it exacerbates more tension. So it's one of the things we are starting to see is that even within the migratory route. So one is enclosures of the commons. So areas that, you know, that we would use naturally to access our pasture and water, salt lakes, all the necessary resources in the rangelands are getting closed up by one thing or another. And in the cases of Turkana, we're seeing, and other places, in infrastructure and extraction of resources. And how this is done within places where migratory routes or migratory areas for pastoralists is getting tense. It was very good to hear Professor Kellen talking about free movement, because we are, if anyone knows about Turkana, to the north we have Ethiopia, and one side we have Uganda, and we have South Sudan. Again, pastoralist communities around which we call the Turkana Basin. And so we've been moving, before colonialism, after colonialism, we've been moving within the region in access of water and pasture. But then we are seeing government, there's a little bit of tension that's coming up. With ourselves, with Uganda, we are part of the Karamoja Ateker. We see that the need for pastoralists to move to Uganda and from Uganda, but we are seeing these tensions between governments, whether it's offering security, providing the necessary frameworks for free movement of pastoralists for water and pasture getting more stringent. And it is something that, because it's getting more intensified, the water infrastructure that was there is getting smaller for the number of users who are now using it, because then, as before, there were a certain number of people who would go to certain seasons, and now you can see more people going, more livestock going. Sometime in the newspaper in Uganda, it indicated about 200,000 cattle from Turkana had moved into Uganda. is the infrastructure in place, and how do we start to have transboundary, cross-country conversation around building infrastructure that supports both communities? Because if you build the water infrastructure in Kenya, but the water towers are in Uganda, it really beats the purpose of where you're putting the infrastructure that supports the communities. In addition to what climate-induced forced migration is doing, you can also see the economic angle that comes in, because then because of the move, because of increased drought, you're seeing the loss of livelihoods and loss of livestock for the pastoralists. And so then the economic forces people to go in and perhaps work, take other jobs, move to the urban areas. So that forced migration, not because they want to leave their livestock, but because there's the extreme drought, and then there is no government support to come in and think around and do the development around this climate-induced stresses on pastoralists. So you're seeing that as a second part to it. And in that, you can see that, because again, we're talking about a rangelands area, you see that there's a degradation of the rangelands. So again, work and efforts to restore. So when people talk about livelihoods, the unfortunate thing is most livelihoods that are brought in due to climate-induced stresses on communities is livelihoods that they don't usually partake. So you come in with an SME, you come in with most interventions by state have been really a different kind of support system that don't really take into account what communities' livelihoods are. And I think that brings me to the point around participation. I really think around bottom-up participation. I mean, it was really interesting listening to a lot of the projects that are being done. But I think what for us, and I come from a very grassroots position, is really how the national interventions, national planning really takes into account local and locally based, local governments' participation in this planning. Because without that sort of support system, you find that everything is really decided at the national level, and then it is brought down for communities where the stresses are actually happening. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. But really, and many times when people are talking about the support that is coming in, what can be done, you see that a lot of times it's really livelihoods aspect. And I know the DRR perspective of disaster risk is really looking at livelihoods as humanitarian, but then sometimes we forget that the health aspect and the gender rule, the gender perspective, the gender lens, looking at how this forced migration is really disproportionately impacting women and children differently from the male counterparts, and just being able to bring out more data around that. Because yes, there's data that is indicating some climate-induced forced migration, but we don't see the gender aspect to it. And so the humanitarian support that comes in is not really thought through in terms of how do we really support the women folk and the children in dealing with this. I think the other aspect is realizing that even especially like with the pastoralists, we've had pastoralists go into Uganda for over 20 years. And because again, it gets harder and harder for them to come back. One, because when you come back home, either the rangelands that you have been using are being used for another purpose, or there's just not much support system that allows people to come. Because if you've then moved with your livestock, and I think this is across many pastoralist communities, that you've moved with your livestock and then you lose your livestock, either due to excess drought, no water, conflict. And because again, we've also seen the conflict intensification or exacerbated by climate change, climate variabilities. Again, looking at it from that perspective and seeing what is the support system that can be given to this population of people who are not necessarily refugees because of conflict, but it has been exacerbated because of their being in a place. Because initially pastoralists moved and requested access to these regions, and they stayed there for a particular duration of time. Now, because of the excess changes in climate, the excess drought, lack of water, you see people staying there longer. And because of that, the tensions between communities who traditionally provided refuge for a lot of the pastoralists, this is now reducing, and it's really creating a lot of stress. And of course, then the political angle comes in, because then this becomes a political tool, whether this population can vote or does not vote, and how, if, for example, you're in a particular place where you do not have voting rights, and the political aspirant or the political elite use this population either as a pawn or as the enemy, seen as the foe. And so really looking at what is the politics around the refugee population, and how politicians, policies and politics is used in either, increasing the conflict between host communities and the refugee population, and how this can be addressed. So in just summarizing, I think key things, as Cecilia has indicated, a lot of data collection has to be done. But I think, again, a lot of the data is really taken from the national level, from the top level. I think we have to start to look at how do we create centers or spaces that are able to collect the data here. I know UNDP and the UN One space started the Africa Borderlands conflict centers. How does that integrate just beyond collecting data on conflicts, but really looking at what are these other aspects that either are conflict related or displacement related, forced migration, and how can we use this infrastructure to start to collect data coming up, to really think around what are the livelihoods that people really need, and what's the support system that people really need. And this takes a lot of real people participation, and not this is supposed to be a lot of thinking around it. I think we have, when we've spoken to the legal infrastructure, legal frameworks, we have a lot of climate change acts. We've seen, at least in places like Australia, you can see governments being held to account around climate justice. So I think it's really starting to look at how do we strengthen the climate change acts within the African governments and African states, and see how we can start to look at what are the other ways, because some of the projects, some of the infrastructure extraction that's happening, Professor Killen talked about, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, again, in a region that governments are continuously talking about extraction of resources, oil and mining is thinking around it, because even as we go into renewable and the just transition, a lot of it still includes a lot of mining from places like the DRC, which are already stressed. So it's really thinking around what are these other things, and what are the real root causes that are exacerbating climate impacts, and how do we work together to make sure that we can ensure that we are actually protecting vulnerable populations, and we are not exacerbating it by waiting for the fact that it happens and people are displaced, and then we come in and we're supporting them. So thank you very much for.
Thanks a lot, Ikal, for this great presentation. And I don't even try to summarize, because I think you have mentioned so many important issues. I think if I would try to summarize, I would probably lose too much of the content that you actually have given. But I think that the most important issue, I think that is also complementing the previous presentations, is actually that we, in all our actions, I think we just always also need to consider the community level. And of course, we can have like the best international instruments, we can have the best regional and national frameworks or policies or projects or whatever, but of course they also always need to have this component to look really to the local level, to look what is really needed at the local level, at the community level, for the reality of the people on the ground. And otherwise, yes, we will stay in kind of at the too high level without really reaching the people that we want to reach. Therefore, thanks a lot for this presentation. And I give the floor to the last speaker of the day. So this is actually about an issue that was also mentioned several times today, about forecasting, modeling, etc. So I'd like to give the floor to Director Kamal Amakran, who is from the Africa Climate Migration Initiative. You have the floor, Director. Thank you.
Greetings to all. Thank you, Lina, for having me today. I hope you hear me well. A warm welcome from the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. I think much has been already said by colleagues, and I would like to focus on three aspects. One, I will take 30 seconds just to take through the ICMI, as we are officially launching the initiative next September on the margins of the UN High-Level Week. Although there has been tremendous progress for the last 18 months, we have been working on this. Second, I would like just to put in perspective the role of the African continent and African countries in pressing the issue and the nexus between climate and mobility, or forced migration and displacement, particularly in the context of the GCM. Third is we always considered that the GCM, and this is from my previous role as political director to the president of the GA and having led the process of the GCM, that the GCM was only the starting of an exercise, the starting of an ambition. And my third part will just focus on how can we take that ambition forward, particularly informed by the commitment of the continent. So one, the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative is a collaboration between the African Union Commission, the UNDP, IOM, UNFCCC, and the World Bank. It's an effort that is informed by the commitment of the African group during the negotiations of the GCM to advance this nexus in the context. This is what led to Objective 2 and elements related to these aspects in Objective 5. But there was this concern that as we are racing to zero emissions in the context of climate action, there was need to start putting people at the heart of climate action. Why? Because the African continent, with its population doubling to 2.5 billion by 2050, will be the most hit, and its population will be the most affected. And colleagues and speakers before have given examples, including personal examples on how they have been affected. I think it should be just put into context that the African continent barely contributes 3% to climate carbon emissions, while pretty much representing close to 20, if not 18% of the world population fully affected. So with this, the idea of the purpose of the ICMI is pretty much to harness mobility in the context of the climate crisis. And I would like to emphasize this point because I think there is an opportunity to move forward with mainstreaming the issue of how to take advantage of mobility to address climate action. But second is how to prepare and how to holistically address the issue of climate forced displacement and migration. And these are all the aspects related to prevention, protection, coordination, etc. So the two aspects is important, and I will go back to the first aspect in my last point, as the aim is to mainstream this in the various existing agendas, whether it's a development agenda, it's the urban agenda, the green agenda. There is an opportunity to create a common space in these various agenda and to press forward one narrative. In this regard, the initiative is working towards developing cutting-edge Africa climate-forced mobility model, complemented by standing capacity for modeling and field research. We are working closely with the African Union Commission in the context of its entities established recently, whether in Morocco, the African Union Observatory, in Khartoum, or in Mali. We are building on the work of the Groundswell report, and we are working closely with UNDP, UNFCCC in the context of their efforts, including, as mentioned, the borderlands. So that's one aspect. And our aim is to provide a tool, a digital tool, to policymakers, to program managers, to civil society and others, in order to have clarity and projections on how populations will move in the continent. You know, the modeling goes down to 1 square kilometer across the entire continent, how they will be affected by the climate factors or drivers. And we're talking here close to 9 climate drivers, and be able to inform that, to inform the policy design and the program design. As it was mentioned by some colleagues earlier, we're trying to anchor this in order to ensure African ownership, but also to press forward the transfer of knowledge from major universities in the world. And we are here supported by Columbia University and other entities across the globe, including the Mixed Migration Center and others, to transfer that knowledge and create an African capacity, an African ownership of these issues. Second is establishing a continent-wide network of change agents, what we call a dedicated community of practice that could drive cutting-edge research, analysis, as well as policy and program development. Why we see the need for such community of practice? Because this is an emerging field. This is a field where most of the actors have been either focus on the climate space or the migration space. And as we bring these two together, I think it was mentioned by a colleague earlier, we need to empower all actors, particularly civil society, the affected population, the affected communities, but also member states and the regions to take forward this and both get the best out of it. This could be an opportunity as much as a challenge we could address. Last but not least, as it was also noted, we would like and we aim to establish an accelerator for action, which can pool resources in order to advance joint programs, joint initiatives. And it was noted earlier, the effort should not be limited to a specific country or specific borders, but it should be focused on communities and regions, because that's the future of Africa. That's what we foresee. How this would be done? Through this robust toolkit, we are now working, and we have been working for close to 18 months, on a comprehensive report on climate-forced mobility in the continent. The report will be entitled Shaping the Future of Mobility in Africa, Addressing Climate-Forced Displacement and Migration. And with this, we will also build an agenda for action that we aim will mobilize efforts to advance a common approach for the way forward. There are many efforts happening in different parts of the continent, and our aim is to ensure that comprehensive engagement and solidify partnerships. I would like to acknowledge, all the partners who have contributed to this exercise, and particularly the government institutions and the German government and the German institutions, as well as others. We hope to present this effort on what we call the African COP, COP27, in November next year. So an invitation, I am happy to put forward an open invitation, as we have brought together over 100 actors for all those who want to be further informed, to engage, particularly in the consultation phase as we go through the data and the projections. We will be happy through colleagues from the UNDP to share all the information. Second, I would like to go back to where should we go from here? And I think the African continent and African countries have made a strong commitment to this effort. What the quintet or the members of the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative are now committed to is to pretty much streamline the climate-forced displacement and migration across the development agenda, the risk disaster agenda, the protection agenda, the urban agenda. Because as it was mentioned earlier, we should not only engage when things are past due. We are talking about adaptation, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about infrastructure. The work needs to be done today. And we need to rethink and match the ambition of the continent when it comes to free mobility, when it comes to the ambition of continent to build one common narrative and common future. And I think, to go back to examples, what Lagos is affected by as a result of the rise of sea level is similar to what Beira is going through, or Alexandria. And I think this is where the stories need to be brought together and bring a common agenda. And of course, last but not least, I think is by mainstreaming this in the context of the various agendas that we could force needed momentum from the financing side. This is not a $10 million exercise or a $100 million exercise, or even a $1 or $2 billion exercise, and this is in dollars, of course. This is a major undertaking, and we need to ensure that all concerned, particularly investors and development agencies and financial entities are fully engaged. Now, last but not least, the continent has a unique opportunity through emphasizing this agenda in the context of the GCM to build a new narrative in the context of the climate action. And I'm here speaking as an African. As I mentioned earlier, we, the continent, are affected only, are tremendously affected by the climate crisis. We all talk about limiting the rise of temperatures to 1.5, but I was just in discussion with colleagues from the IPCC last week. Most of the continent is already beyond 1.5, is going towards 2 by mid-century. And as such, with the continent that will host close to 1/4 of the world population by 2050, and only contributing 3% today and up to 6% of carbon emissions by 2050. We need to bring people at the heart of climate action. And I think mobility is a way to do it. Other entities, political coalitions, have proved that it's worth it, and here I'm talking about the European Union. And as such, I encourage all entities across the globe to support the continent in that effort. The ambition is there. It's just the hands and the builders that need to come along. I will stop there, and I would like to thank again the organizers for inviting me for this effort, and acknowledge again, particularly the role of IGAD in pressing this effort forward, and in pressing actually since 2015 in the context of the compact process that climate is fully transparent in the GCM document. Over to you.
Thanks a lot there, Dr. Kamal. It was really great to hear already, even though it is not yet officially launched, but to hear already kind of about the Africa Climate Migration Initiative. And as you also have said, this is definitely a topic that is definitely needed to act right now and not to wait 10 more years to come into play. And I think, as we also have seen from the previous presentations, there are also kind of ongoing work under the Multi-Partner Trust Fund and another modeling side funded by the German government. So I think, of course, we are all very much looking forward to kind of have this initiative ongoing, and then afterwards to make sure that we also create the best synergies between all these different projects. Therefore, thanks a lot, Dr. Kamal. And I think with this one, we are finalized with all the different presentations, and we're coming to the questions and answers section. As of now, I haven't yet seen a specific question in the chat box, but if you have a question, then you can raise your hand and then speak and talk to all the panelists. So please raise your hand if you have a question. And otherwise, we will put up some questions on our side that were prepared. Maybe, Bent, you can already put on the slide with some other questions if there are no questions from the floor, so that the panelists also have a chance to actually reflect on some additional questions. Thanks a lot, Brent. And there are many questions, and I think we don't have so much time left. We still have 20 minutes, but we might not have time to address all of them. And maybe we can start with the first 3 questions, if there are no other questions from the floor. So the first one would actually be, what are kind of the key messages that you would like to bring into the IMRF that is taking place early next year? And then the second question would be, which additional avenues could be explored by all the different partners, whether it is government or other stakeholders at the global, regional, national, and community level? And the third question would be, how can partners facilitate knowledge exchange on effective practices to address human mobility challenges in climate and disaster contexts? So if there are no other questions, I think I would give the panelists, according to the list of speakers, the time to quickly reflect and then give maybe one comprehensive response per person. And I know that Madame Fatia from IGAD was the first speaker, but I will not speak first. So I think I will give it then to the second person first, who was Professor Walter Kellin. So maybe you can give your reflections on either all of them or to one of them that you see the most pertinent one.
Thank you, Lena. Let me highlight just one or two aspects. First, I think one important message we got from Ms. Hikal Angele was her emphasis on really listening to the communities and do bottom-up planning. If you really want to advance, and I mean that's true for this issue, it's so true for many other issues. If you really want to have tangible success at local levels, then we not only have to consult with communities, but really make them part of planning processes. That's very much community-based planning. And I think that's an important message. The second message, of course, is what I also alluded to in my presentation, the importance of capacity building at all levels. It's good to have data, it's good to have knowledge, it's good to have standard operating procedures and so on. But in the end, whether things are implemented has a lot to do with capacity. And we know that, of course, at all the different levels, capacities to address these challenges are limited, and particularly because, as was also mentioned, I think it was by Cecilia and Kira, we cannot really, in most contexts, take separate displacement linked to disaster and climate change factors to separate them from other factors. These movements are always multi-causal, and this means more complexity. And this then again means more capacity needed to address those. So that's question one. As regards question three, not so much a recommendation, but rather a little bit of information. We know that most displacement takes place within countries and not across borders, and people end up as internally displaced persons. The high-level panel on internal displacement, which was set up by the Secretary General, will end of September publish its report. I was one of the expert advisors there. And what I already can say is that one of the proposals and recommendations is to set up for platforms at regional levels for exchange of effective practices among authorities, among other stakeholders. And I think it will be important to bring to those tables not only internal displacement linked to conflict, but also internal displacement in the context of disasters and climate change. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Walter Kelling. This is extremely good news. I think we all would like to participate in this platform for exchange, because I think this is exactly what we need. We need to have these exchanges across all the different countries from the African continent. And maybe also just to add up one on the point that you have just said, also as an information for all the participants, we also had a regional exchange on the GCM review last week in Addis Abeba. And we had all the different member states from IGAD present. And we also had already some kind of voluntary reports that were presented there, because some of the governments already did prepare the voluntary report for the GCM implementation. And actually, throughout the discussion of this regional review, it was very like the topic of climate change, and also the need also to have appropriate data available. I think these were issues that were mentioned several times, and I think this will also then come up in the discussion in the next few days, and then of course also in the IMRF next year. But again, thanks a lot for your reflections on these different questions. And with that, I would like to give the floor to the next person. Unfortunately, the representatives from the German government had to leave. So I think I will not give the floor again to Germany, but we have enough panelists still on the call. So I'd like to give the floor to UNDP next. Maybe you can also reflect on these questions. And I think we still have 15 minutes. So maybe you can like have maximum 5 minutes. Thank you. If Cecilia is actually still on the call.
Apologies, colleagues. I think Cecilia had to log off because she had to join another discussion.
Okay, thank you for the information. But we can also give the floor to then the panelists who are still on the call. So let me ask Ms. Ikal again to come in with some reflections.
Thanks. Yeah, so quick ones, just I'll summarize it together. I think one, it is, as Cecilia mentioned, a rights-based approach to human mobility, just to really, sometimes, you know, you see how it is treated. There's really a lack of rights-based approach. And I think that for me, in terms of how governments, the additional avenues that governments and partners, you know, can really think around it, is really looking at things from a rights-based approach, as Professor Killen had indicated in his presentation. I think the other one is really looking at participatory planning, because through participatory planning, looking at the work that is done by the monitoring teams, you can start to look at and plan for possible climate-induced impacts, whether it is migration or not. So really trying to use the data that is very important for the planning. I think those for me are the key things that we look at. But in terms of when you talk about facilitating knowledge exchange, I think a lot of the knowledge has focused on perhaps the science and all that. But then there is, I think we need to start really looking at what are the other sources of data, what are the other sources of information that we think are important in the knowledge, and that will include indigenous knowledge. I think on board indigenous knowledge is very critical to understand the context that all this is happening, because it's not happening in a vacuum, it's happening in geographies and spaces that already have existing information, existing knowledge, and that would be important to plug into, and not to forget the political angle to it. Just as we think about this, while we'll appreciate the noble idealistic aspects, again, we've got to be really alive to the politics around it. Recently seeing my own government, every time before an election, they will claim to close refugee camps, and just putting the pressure around the refugee populations and the tensions around it, and the fact that we are not really providing the necessary policy frameworks to allow for refugee populations who are forced migrants to come into this space to really live a dignified life and are constantly threatened. And it is by design, because the system benefits from refugee populations who do not have the necessary legal frameworks to allow them to live and work within certain geographies. So I think for me, it's really looking at it, that broad path, because while somebody is, you know, displaced and is living in as a refugee, they really should be able to work and earn and seek a living and just grow their livelihoods. And I think those are things that we don't talk about. So the climate impacts really exacerbate their economic situation and their social and economic situations wherever they may be.
Thanks a lot for these additional reflections, because I think these are exactly the issues that were not mentioned before, but are extremely important, that we should not forget them. So thanks a lot for these comments. And then last but not least, Dr. Kamal, maybe you also had some time to reflect on these questions. So please go ahead and present your few remarks. Thank you. And Dr. Kamal, you're still on mute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's the sentence of the year of the COVID period. We are on mute. Lina, thank you very much. I will build on previous speakers by saying that it is important that we move beyond the response agenda, and we move into the prevention agenda. And by prevention, disaster displacement could be addressed through resilience, adaptation, and ownership. Of course, these are not only the ways or the only ways to do it. And as such, I think it's important, as we discussed, particularly in the context of the continent that is aiming to achieve growth, economic integration, we need to press in the other agendas, namely the adaptation agenda, the resilience agenda, the climate action agenda, that these elements that relate directly to mobility and climate-forced mobility are fully taken into consideration. I served as a peacekeeper in many member states in the continent, and trust me, the passport is only known to those who are the few, and the borders are only acknowledged in the mindset of technocrats and politicians. The continent is constantly on the move. Our continent is a continent on the move. So we need to have an agenda for a continent on the move. When it comes to point B, and just as my previous colleague mentioned, we need to be realistic. In order to ensure that it's all hands on deck, namely you have the financial need of the World Bank, of the development entities and institutions, all governments, major donors, but also that sense of all African ownership. We need an African agenda. And we have seen that in the absence of that partnership between the continent and the rest of the world, between the multilateral entities and the regional ownership, it is difficult to take that message to the locally. Third point, I fully agree with colleagues that emphasize the importance of communities. And this is one of the aspects that we have fought hard in the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, is that our work should not be moved based on political borders, but around geographies, common geographies. As I mentioned earlier, if you're a pastoralist, whether you are in Niger or in Mali or in other parts of the continent, you are living the same challenges. And the same thing if you are living in a delta area or a coastal area that's affected by the rise of sea level. This is important because the continent, we need to support the continent in its ambition to further its integration. It's being the son of the continent, it's a mosaic, but it's a mosaic that can say one story and has one common identity. And I think that's what we should try to build. Beyond the political borders, beyond the technicalities, how we can bring that the common challenges along. So the people who are living in Dakar understand very much what others are going through in Ethiopia or in Djibouti or in Kenya or in Angola and parts of the continent. That actually, when we did the when we conducted the field research to understand the hotspots and to capture the human narrative, we found that many parts of the continent have been cropped out of this debate because they are not the if I can call the focus of major donors. And I think this is what we need to get out. How do we empower the continent? How do we build local and strong change actors? How do we ensure that the knowledge and the technology is in African hands? That's how we will be, and we will become a strong partner to our partners in the global community, whether it's the Europeans, the Americans, the Asians, or others. I will stop there. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kamal, for these strong words towards the end of these presentations. And actually, I just kind of pick or repeat what you have said, that actually what we need is actions that are going beyond borders. And with borders, I think, as you have mentioned, it is not only about the geographical borders, but also about the borders, if you can call them borders, across the different policy areas. Because as we all have seen, human mobility linked to disasters and climate change is a topic that it really addresses all these different policy areas. It is not only an issue about migration or displacement or disaster risk reduction or climate change. It actually is addressing all these different areas. And this is also why we need to have really a holistic approach in making sure that these issues are all addressed simultaneously in all these different policy areas. And with this one, I think we're coming to the end of these different presentations. And unless I don't see any more comments in the chat function or a hand up from one of the panelists, I just want to say already thank you on behalf of all the organizers, which is IGAD, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and UNDP. And thanks a lot to all the speakers and presenters. It was a very rich discussion, and I think we are all used now to have virtual meetings, and we are used to have these events, but I think it was really enriching and a very good overview of all these different levels. So I really thank each and every one of you to attend the side event today. And with this one, I think I'll close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Bye-bye.
You, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.